Yes, and welcome back. This will be the final session of this event, an introduction to edge sciences. And to close, we will have with us Dr. Paul Smith, which is a psychic spy, an alumnus of the Department of Defense's the Stargate Remote Viewing Program, a Desert Storm veteran. He retired from the Army in 1996 and is an author and frequent conference speaker and interview guest. President and Chief Instructor for Remote Viewing Instructional Services, Incorporated. He is also a founding director and past president of the nonprofit International Remote Viewing Association. His books are Reading the Enemy's Mind and The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. So we'll play his video in just a second, but before we go to that, I want to remember every one of you that this free event was sponsored by the Rhine Center, the Parapsychological Association, and the Society for Scientific Exploration. We'll have our annual conference, a joint effort between the Parapsychological Association and the Society for Scientific Exploration in 2 weeks approximately. And just a reminder that the early bird is closing tomorrow. And remember that members of either association have a 50% discount for the tickets of that event. So hopefully you consider joining if you're not already a member. And without further ado, I'll play Paul's video, and we'll have him at the end for the Q&A.
It is. There's, of course, a lot of things that you hear and see about remote viewing out there, particularly in the internet community. Hopefully, this will kind of give you a baseline from which to judge and understand this topic from. So, I'm going to start off with a story. It happened in Africa in March of 1979, specifically Zaire, which is currently one of the Congos, or maybe the Congo. Names tend to change in Central Africa from time to time. The Russians were missing an airplane. It so happened that the CIA had paid a Libyan pilot. The plane that was missing had been based in Libya, and they had paid a Libyan pilot to steal the airplane and fly it to some undisclosed location. I speculate it was probably South Africa. This was a Tu-22 bomber, but it had been outfitted as a reconnaissance aircraft, and it was loaded with high-tech and highly secret cryptological equipment, spy gear, all that kind of thing. Just the kind of juicy thing that the CIA would love to get their hands on. And of course, the Soviets were longing for the same thing, except in the other direction from us. But this time, there was some success. The pilot stole the plane, but he got cold feet. And somewhere over Africa, he bailed out and left the plane on autopilot. And when it ran out of gas, it crashed. The CIA knew roughly where it might have gone down within several thousand square miles, but they couldn't find it. Their satellites just weren't picking it up. We found out later because it went in kind of perpendicular into the ground, and it had gone into the triple canopy jungle. This is not the plane. This just shows you what it might look like there. And in fact, roughly maybe in the country of Zaire. You can see it's a pretty good sized place. So failing technical means of finding it, the CIA asked a remote viewer, essentially, a young Air Force enlisted woman, to use her ESP abilities. She was working with a gentleman named Dale Graff, some of you may know him, to try and locate the wreckage. They gave her a map of the entire continent of Africa and said, it's on here, it's down here somewhere. And in the process, she went through whatever her process was. And in the end, she drew a small circle on the ground that covered about 3 square miles. And the embassy sent in a special ops team to try and see if they could actually find it. And as they were going in, they met natives coming out carrying pieces of Tu-22 Soviet bomber. So the airplane was recovered. We don't know anything more about the story since then for obvious reasons. But we do know the plane was recovered. And in fact, this is going to be a bit of a, so they found the aircraft in the circle. I'm going to try something here. We'll see if the tech works. Jimmy Carter, former President Carter, who was president at the time, actually confirmed that this happened. Now, he remembered it a little vaguely, didn't have all the facts down exactly, but the bones of it are here. And this was about 20 years after the event. And he said this.
The only strange and inexplicable event that I have that has been discussed publicly is that one time we had a small plane go down somewhere in Africa, and we needed very much to find out where that plane had crashed, and we were not able to find it by surveillance from our satellites.
Mm-hmm.
So the director of the CIA, he was also director of all the intelligence agencies, heard about a woman in California that was a medium or something. I don't know the title for. And he contacted her, and she gave him the latitude and longitude of the plane's whereabouts. And the next time one of our space satellites went over that area, we located the plane where she said it was. And that's the only time that I have ever experienced something that was inexplicable while I was president.
I think it's kind of funny that he specified when he was president. So anyway, yeah, as I said, he got the details a little bit wrong, but the general bare bones of it he got right. And I say he got it wrong. It may well be he told the story that way to kind of camouflage some of the actual facts about it that he was still being cautious about. It's hard to say. Anyway, so what is remote viewing? This is a kind of a quick sort of a definition of it. It's the act or the process of receiving real impressions, concepts, and sensory data from a distant or hidden target using only the powers of the mind alone. In other words, it's a form of ESP or extrasensory perception. It is a learned skill. Pretty much anybody can learn it. It's based on an innate ability that you and I and just about everybody else has. But it does depend on following the correct principles and a lot of practice to develop consistency and accuracy in the process. So some things it isn't. Now, people get kind of confused about this. You'll often hear people say, well, remote viewing is just X or remote viewing is just Y. And that just shows that they need a little bit of education on what remote viewing actually is. It is not channeling. It does not require the involvement of any discarnate entities. It doesn't require that you have any spirit guides or anything like that. I'm not saying those things don't exist. I'm saying they aren't relevant to the remote viewing process. It isn't astral projection or out-of-body experience. Now, there may be a relationship between these, but there's a significant difference as well. And if you're curious about this, I have a blog article out there, and I should have probably linked it. But at any rate, I go into this in detail about how they're different, but how they might be in some ways connected. It is not, as I like to say, video in the head. This is kind of the Hollywood version of being psychic and including remote viewing. It isn't like you have a video or a film spooling out in your head and where you see everything just like you were seeing it kind of in real time. It's not at all like that. I'll explain a bit more what it is like as we go. All right. So remote viewing results. So when you get the results of a remote viewing session, as we call it, those include written and verbal, so words, include sketched, and that's an important element in it, and sometimes even clay model responses. I'll show you here in a little bit a clay model result and some sketch results as well. And remote viewing requires that you follow a certain protocol. You could think of a protocol as a set of rules that you have to follow it for it to be considered true remote viewing. There's a lot of people out there that do what they call remote viewing, but if it doesn't follow this protocol, at least as the originators of remote viewing are concerned, it doesn't really count as pure remote viewing. These rules or protocol are as follows. A remote viewer may not be told anything about this target until they're done with the session. This is what we call a blind condition. The viewer is blind to the target. Further, nobody who has anything to do with the remote viewer before that session begins is supposed to know anything about the target. They're also supposed to be blind. We call this a double blind condition. And in science, in a science experiment with remote viewing and in operational remote viewing, this is essential. This is an essential ingredient. When you're involved in training, sometimes it'll be single blind, particularly early on as the viewer's trying to learn the process, as the student is trying to learn the process. But for all the really significant kind of remote viewing events, it should be double blind, where neither the viewer nor anyone else they come in contact with should know anything about the target until after all the remote viewing process is over. The target data must be verifiable. I know, there's lots of folks out there who love, somebody's calling me, who love to remote view like UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever. And sure, I mean, it's a tool that can be useful to that. But in an actual clean remote viewing experiment or process, it should be done against actual targets for which the viewer can be presented also with feedback. So it has to be a real target for which you get feedback. And there's a core reason for this. It's because the viewer, in order to actually improve or even know if they've succeeded, you have to be able to confirm for them what the target was once they're done. Okay, here's some examples of remote viewing results. This is after a series of pages and a number of sketches that start off very simply and eventually morph through the session. This was the final sketch that the viewer arrived at. This is one I did, so I know exactly how this happened. I had no clue what this was, but as I went through the remote viewing process, it became clearer and clearer to me what this, how this should look on the page. And I sketched this as my final result, and you can see that it matches pretty well. Some of the best remote viewing sessions will have these really clear, obvious results. That doesn't mean that you can't have a successful remote viewing session and the sketch not be dramatically like the target, but that there's a lot of explanation going on there. I won't get into that for now. Here's another example. This was a clay model. As you can see, the target was this open pit mine, and the viewer created this concentric ringed structure out of clay as they're going through the process. They said, well, it's like this. It's got these rings that go down, and it's actually a pretty nice representation of it if you think about it. Not all remote viewing results are picture perfect, as I mentioned. So for example, you see this one. You see what the target is. Is it? Hang on a second. Let me fix my phone so it doesn't ring anymore. Should have done that earlier. So anyway, you can see the target is this bridge. It's got these arches that go up and there and down. The viewer, blind to the target, sketched, said, this is land over here. This is land over here. This is water. This is what they thought it was a platform floating on the water, did have stanchions or a railing along it. And they just felt compelled to do this arched shape here. And when I was talking to them afterwards, they said, I had no idea why I put that arch in there. It was just like I felt like it belonged there. And so they sketched it in. Now, this isn't a great sketch. This is not something that just miraculously looks exactly like the target. But you can certainly see the family resemblance. And a lot of remote viewing results are like this. They are somewhat distorted versions of the actual target. They may have things out of place. There may be things that aren't supposed to be that are, and vice versa. Misinterpretations, which I'll address that in a little bit. But you can see it definitely is still has this very strong resemblance to what the target actually is. Let me turn my phone off too. Somebody really wants to get a hold of me. John, that isn't you, is it? Dang it. There we go. Okay. Some of them are very literal, but they don't look like it when you see it to begin with. But then when you see the feedback, you'll see, oh, right. So this is another session I did. I thought this was an owl or maybe some kind of animal. And this I thought was a shaving brush, but my subconscious knew what it was and proceeded to guide me in how I made the sketch. And you can see it's very literal. I just didn't get the interpretation of it right. Some remote viewing results are both visual and verbal. So for example, this particular session, the remote viewer did sketches that, there you can see that it's kind of a dome-shaped thing with these vertical sort of openings in it, and big rectangular doors and vegetation around about, and then wrote a summary about it. So let me break this down. So first of all, what they said was that this target was domed, had multi-levels, repetitive square rectangular shapes, cream color outside. Inside there were lots of colors: gold, yellow, red, blue, gray, and green. It was constructed of wood and stone. Light was shining through colored glass. The structure itself was ornate, contained art, was historical. There were two large, prominent wooden rectangular doors. People here associated with the target had flowing clothing with head drapings. And she had an impression of seriousness, respectfulness, deeply felt feelings. She felt it was a holy place. So if you all were here in the room with me, I'd ask you what you thought it was. I'm sure each of you have a speculation as to what this target might have been. I'll show you. It was Ettal Monastery in Germany, near Oberammergau. And you can see that her sketching was really quite remarkable. She got the trees in the right place. She got the stairs in the right place. She got these are a little bit rounded, but pretty much they're tall and thin. Got the windows right around the dome. She got the doors right, if I didn't say that already. It's really nicely done sketch for considering that she had no idea what the target was. She was working totally blind, just working off of the cue that she's given, which is just an arbitrary number. So a little bit more about it. Here you notice this is the front door, these large rectangular doors, lots of art inside. There's stained glass in various parts of it, so light coming through colored glass. Yeah, it's very ornate in here. So that was a very nice description, an excellent remote viewing result. Some remote viewing results are mostly graphic or kinesthetic, though. Kinesthetic means that you create it with your hands, just generate a model or whatever, a clay model. And you see, this is a really great one. This one's done by Tom McNair, who was one of my colleagues at Fort Meade and arguably one of the best practitioners of controlled remote viewing that we've ever had. So there are a number of kinds of remote viewing. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the one I teach and the one that's kind of the granddaddy of most of them out there is a form called controlled remote viewing that was developed by the original creators and developers of remote viewing. There are a bunch of offshoots of that. There's a variety of those that they're kind of like descendants, if you will, of the original controlled remote viewing. There's a kind of remote viewing called extended remote viewing, which a number of folks practice. This is more of a meditative form of remote viewing. There's a group in Hawaii Remote Viewing Guild, who have their own fairly unique kind of approach to remote viewing. And then there's what I call GRV. I've heard this also called freeform remote viewing. It's really the kind that was practiced originally, which means everybody who tried remote viewing was just kind of doing it trial and error. They didn't really have a particular method that they learned. And so each one of them developed their own kind of approach to it. So that kind of gives you a general flavor of what's out there. Controlled remote viewing actually is quite structured. It consists of 6 stages or steps. I'm not going to go through these, but I'll show you an example of a controlled remote viewing session. This is one I did. And I just put the whole thing up here so you can see what one looks like if all the pages assembled in order. You start off with just getting a very brief concept of the target. Then as you go along, you get more and more detail. At a certain point, you start trying to sketch it. And if you note, the sketches tend to morph. And you'll see what the result or the actual target was here in a minute. But it starts off as kind of just sort of a bunch of layered structures. This was drawn on its side. So it's vertical here because it's arranged the way the rest of these. Then again, this is one I did. I had this impression that, no, this isn't quite right. It's more round and kind of tall. Then I felt like that's a little too tall. And then I did it and it's a little kind of smaller around, and that wasn't quite right. And then I did this one. Okay, that felt a little bit better. Starting to get AOL of a Coliseum or some kind of sports facility. AOL is mental noise, your left brain guessing what it might be. And this was my final sketch. And then I wrote a summary about it, which kind of gathered all that information together. Okay. So that's what we would call a stage 3 controlled remote viewing session would look like. This is okay. So we bring the sketches together, the final ones, and that was the target. It's the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing. Interestingly, when I did this, I had not followed the Olympics. I'd been, I don't know, somewhere, and I wasn't paying attention to them. I had no idea what this was or what it looked like. As I'm sketching it, I'm feeling like there's all these kind of lines on it, but I couldn't really quite capture what those were. I did know there were other structures around about, and you see them, scattered around here and about around the stadium. And what was interesting was on this, when I did this sketch, I just felt compelled to put little, I didn't know what they were, like a fuzzy thing with a trail coming off of it. I wasn't quite clear what that was. Turned out the tasking was to remote view the Beijing Bird's Nest Stadium on the opening night of the Olympics during the fireworks. So I even apparently got the fireworks in on this without even having any clue that's what I was doing. But this gives you an idea about how a CRV or controlled remote viewing session goes together and how it looks when it's done. All right, there are challenges for remote viewing. The first and probably biggest one is fear of failure. Maybe not the biggest one. It's an important one though. Fear of failure, and on the other side, there's a flip side to that, desire for success. That actually gets in the way of most remote viewers' progress at one time or another. You really don't want to fail. You really want to succeed. And the harder you try to not fail, the more likely it is you're going to fail. There's a very interesting kind of a dynamic, even a paradox going on here. You have to be fully willing and completely accepting of the possibility you're going to fail before you can succeed. I refer to this as the Zen of remote viewing. It's very much that you focus on the process and you don't worry about what the outcome is going to be. And if you can achieve that state, which is a very Zen-like state, Zen notoriously, or famously, maybe that's a better word, Zen famously wants you to focus, to pay all your attention on how you do things, how you do it, and let the outcome go until you get there. Like Zen archery, it's all about how you draw the bow, how you knock the arrow, how you breathe, how you release. The target is the last thing that you care about in Zen archery. And that's the way it is in remote viewing. You have to learn to not worry about whether you're going to get the target or not, but rather how you go through the process. And if you master the process, if you do the process properly, you actually will end up getting the target, describing the target, perceiving the target. It's really an interesting kind of dynamic. So anyway, fear of failure is the first issue. The second issue is a thing called mental noise. Anytime we do anything, we've got all this racket going on in our brains. We've got memories, we've got speculations, we've got guesses, we've got desires and wants and things that conflict with what it is that we want to do. And when you're being psychic, it's very pronounced because your left brain, to speak very loosely here, your left brain always wants you to give the answer. That's its job. It's to give you the answer. It's supposed to analyze the information that comes in in your normal daily life. When you start trying to be psychic, where the bandwidth is even lower than it is in everyday life, your left brain starts trying to jump to conclusions about what it is you're perceiving. You end up with these wrong guesses that we call those analytical overlay. There's other elements of it as well, but this is all mental noise. And if you don't learn how to control it, it can really get in your way of perceiving what the target is. In fact, oftentimes when I'm doing interviews and things, the interview host will want to know, well, what is it you teach people when you teach them the remote view? And I tell them there's three things. The first thing is to recognize the signal. Okay. Now the signal is actually very subtle, as you can imagine, in a psychic sort of an environment. The signal is quite quiet and quite subtle. And so it can take a little bit of experience before you start to recognize it, but there are things that I tell my students that help them. The second thing I teach them is how to recognize mental noise. There are characteristics of this mental noise that's going on that if you learn how to recognize them, you can start parsing out that from the signal. And then the third thing they learn is how to tell the difference and how to manage the difference between the signal and the noise. But mental noise is a big problem, but it can be dealt with up to a point. You just have to learn the process. And of course, it sounds simple enough. That's where, of course, all the work is learning to recognize the signal and learning how to deal with the mental noise and how to then tell the difference. Okay, so here's an example of some mental noise going on in a session. So the viewer got, this is also another CRV session. The viewer got the number, the ready, set, go number, and went through the early process of this, started getting sensory impressions, and hopefully you can read some of those. I'm not going to deal with those right now. I'll give you a little summary at the end. And then started drawing sketch, and they drew this sketch, okay? And they thought about this while and said, that's just not quite right. And then they redid the sketch, and you notice here they made them think of a cable car. This is an indication that they recognized that there was some mental noise going on. Cable car was that mental noise. So they're excluding that by writing it down and getting rid of it. But they sketched this. They realized from the first sketch, let me go back, that it was some kind of a bridge. Target was some kind of a bridge. From the second sketch, they thought, no, it's more like this. It is a suspension bridge. They felt like it still had towers, and this was, of course, water. Then they said the target is an expansive structure. It is broad. You got impressions of gray and dark clay red. There's water present. It makes me think of a suspension bridge. Okay. Well, in fact, that's exactly what it was. It is dark gray red. It is arched over. It is a suspension bridge, although not in the way that they were thinking it was at this point in their session. And but still, that's pretty good representation of what it is in general. When you compare it to this, though, you see there are minor elements in here that are correct, but this kind of misses the boat, if you will. This is what I would call mental noise. This is analytical overlay. The left brain recognized that there was a bridge, and then it recognized a few elements of it, and then it tried to put it together in a way that just wasn't accurate. And that's the thing we struggle with in remote viewing all the time. Okay, final thing is, that I want to talk about in terms of challenges is this idea that it's a fragmentary process. Remember, I mentioned video in the head before. Well, the problem with the video and head thing is it assumes that you get a full image picture all at once. And you know, people, if they don't know what remote viewing is, will often say, well, remote viewing, am I not going to see just a very clear image or picture of the target? And the answer is no. It's remote viewing, but it is viewing in a fragmentary kind of way, plus all the other sense perception modes are involved as well. You can hear, smell, taste, touch, as well as see, but it's all kind of fragmentary and jumbled up, and you have to learn how to sort that out. That's part of the learning process. So let me illustrate how the fragmentary part of the process works. When you just first start out, you get bits and pieces of the target. This is another one by Tom McNair, and these sketches were early on in the process. He's just kind of feeling how the shapes are. As he gets deeper into the session, and I'm not showing you all the pages here because that would take a long time. This is about 20 pages long. As he gets deeper in the session, the shapes kind of come together. The dimensional nature of this target starts to coalesce. The bits come together, if you will. And then they start to, the relationships between them become more evident. And then it becomes more refined, even can kind of draw a sort of a map of this target. From there, then he goes on to a more refined sketch. From there, he goes on to making this model. This was one of those three-dimensional model targets. It was funny because he said, well, there's a whole bunch of these, but I don't make them all. So I'm going to make one, and I'm going to make dots where the rest of them are to save himself a little work. But you notice he's got these three towers. He's got this round tower in front, buildings in between. This around the side, he said, is a road, but he couldn't make it flat because it was clay. Anyway, when it all came together, this was the target. You note the water tower out here, the three towers here, the buildings in between. He didn't get them all, but he got at least an indication of them. And then the substation back here with all of these towers. Okay, this is an awesome, awesome result. But it does show you how it starts off in bits and pieces and how it then kind of coalesces and comes together. Okay, So where did remote viewing come from is a question. Now, it has some antecedents fairly past in history in the past, but in modern times, it originated with a man named Ingo Swann. He was doing some research about the same time as Lloyd, probably. Well, I don't know when Lloyd was out there, but Ingo was working with some of the same people that Lloyd encountered. He did some work for Carlos Osis at the American Society of Psychical Research. He worked as a research subject with Gertrude Schmeidler at City College in New York. And but he was not your passive kind of research subject. He was a bit feisty, and he was a little bit annoyed about some of the protocols they were using. He just didn't feel like they were maximizing the potential that a human psychic could achieve. So he came up with a protocol that actually was the basis of what I mentioned earlier about the remote viewing protocol, the rules that you needed to practice. Now you went beyond that though and came up with a couple of actual experimental protocols. One of them is what we call outbounder, which is where one person goes to a target that's selected randomly. The remote viewer stays back in a secluded room, doesn't know where that other person went. It could be two people, not just one, I guess, or three, whatever. An outbounder team goes to that location. The viewer has no idea where they went, but what he or she does is focus his or her consciousness on the location of the people that are acting as the beacons, essentially, that have gone to that location, and then perceive the setting that they're in. It worked really well, and that became the basis of the remote viewing research later on. Okay, so he created remote viewing. He even also came up with a term for it. Here he is. He was an artist working as an artist at the time in New York City, and here's his masterwork called Millennium. It's now in the American Museum of Visionary Art in Baltimore. So if anyone lives out there, they really ought to go to the American Museum of Visionary Art and check it out. They've got, I think, 5 of his paintings there, including this one. It's really, really amazing. All right. So the people who then coalesced around Ingo, in a way, were Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann. They did an experiment in 1972 that was successful. Again, I won't go into the details of how they got together, but that experiment got the attention of the CIA because the CIA had been researching Soviet involvement in what we would call paranormal research. The Soviets were spending literally hundreds of millions of hundreds of millions of dollars a year in their currency equivalent to the US dollar. And the CIA didn't know why, but they also knew the Russians didn't tend to throw away money, so there must be a reason for it. And so they were worried that they needed to find out what the Russians were up to, the Soviets, I guess, really were up to. And so when they got word that these two had done an experiment and Puthoff was actually working in a highly classified research facility that supported the U.S. government, it still is called SRI International. The CIA figured they could get him to do the research. And so they built a program around Hal Puthoff. Ingo, of course, still associated with it. And then a few months later, Russell Targ came in. Now, this is a picture, I don't know, not too long after this one was taken on the right. And this is Russell on the left. This is Hal on the right. And you can see why I often talk about them as being the Simon and Garfunkel of the remote viewing world. Anyway, so they were the core of this program. In 1982, Russell left the program, and Hal kept on as the director until 1985. And let me see where I go next. While all that was going on, that says 1984, by the way, on the right. In 1979, the Army decided to get involved. Actually, in 1977, but the program went live in 1979 with F. Holmes Skip Atwater as the primary mover in this program. He was actually tasked by a 2-star general to create a remote viewing program in 1977, and they did their first remote viewing sessions after they'd recruited sources and done their research in 1979. And we worked out of these old buildings here, this one here and a matching one across this little road that you can't see here. That was our headquarters. I joined in late 1983. This is Tom McNair. You've seen a couple of his sessions now. Bill Ray, Ed Dames, myself when I had hair and whereas it was somewhat skinnier, and of course Ingo Swann. And this is Charlene Schufelt, who is one of our number as well. So we were trained by Ingo Swann to do CRV and continued on there until, until 1995. I left in 1990. All of us here left at differing times, and others came in to replace us. But in 1995, the program was shut down. What happened was, I don't know if I have a slide about this. Okay, so in 1986, let me do my slides here. In 1979, it started going operational. 1984, we were trained and we continued to work until 1986. Early 86, the program was transferred to the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Army got out of the business and DIA picked it up. Worked at DIA until 1995, when when Congress decided that the CIA should be the one running the program. Well, here's the problem with that. The CIA didn't want it. The director at the time, Robert Deutsch, I think it was Robert, might have been John, I forget. Anyway, I keep going to look that up and keep forgetting to remind myself, but Deutsch was his last name. He was the director and he was adamantly opposed to remote viewing. I don't know exactly what role he had in canceling it, but the program was canceled literally to the day the CIA acquired it. You may have heard that the CIA had a report done that investigated remote viewing in its use in the intelligence community and concluded that it was of no use. What you should know about that report is that they didn't even start doing the research and start writing the report until the month after they shut the program down. So they already had decided to shut down before there was any such report done. They just did the report later to kind of justify what they did. And I won't go into the details here, but there are a lot of reasons why that report is actually very faulty analysis, and actually its conclusions are not trustworthy. But I guess since the CIA did it, you're not surprised. Okay, so when people say, remote viewing, in military doing remote viewing, that sounds kind of like this kind of a deal. Somebody with a crystal ball telling you where to aim your artillery or whatever. It's not exactly like that, but I will show you some examples of how we used it. So for example, this project was done in 1986 for the DIA. The target turned out to have been, this was another one of mine. You know what, I did these sketches and I said this reminded me of a MIRV. Now, MIRV is essentially a multi-headed warhead for a ballistic missile. And in fact, that's exactly what the target turned out to be. I had been targeted on a Soviet MIRV, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle, a multi-headed warhead, and had actually captured the basic nature of this thing. Another one, we were actually targeted on the stealth aircraft program, not because we didn't know what it was, at least in terms of the US government, but because we wanted to find out what Russian remote viewers might be able to do. And it was kind of scary because, as you see, we did do a fairly decent job of capturing this thing. There was actually two of them. And even the descriptors, the verbal descriptors about low radar signature, the special skin it had, which it did and does, and so on. We viewers and nobody in the remote viewing program knew about the stealth program. We were tasked completely blindly on it. And as you can see, the summer of 1987, we got our feedback when the stealth aircraft was, the existence of it was declassified in the middle of 88. So we opened up the papers and said, oh, look, that's what we were doing last year. We recognized it as soon as we saw it. But we weren't told or anything. We did not know at the time what it was. We're just completely blind. This is a Soviet phased array radar. You can see what the actual thing looks like. We have photos of it now that the Iron Curtain has gone down. This was my sketch of it over here. Used it in counter narcotics. Lots of stories I could tell there. I won't go into it now, but this is an example from one of our sessions. They wanted to know where on a container ship the contraband was. And this ship used dowsing, remote viewing and dowsing together to capture where in the cargo it was. It turned out to be correct. They did recover contraband at that point on that ship. And I want to mention time is no obstacle. I think I'm running out of time here, so I better be quick. On 15 May 1987, I was asked to do a remote viewing session. The tasking was something along the lines of describe for us an event that's going to happen in the near future that would be important for us to know about. And you can think of this as a kind of a psychic fishing expedition. They didn't know what the event might be, but they sort of thought there is always an event. What's the most important one for us to know about in the future? And so I got these coordinates. This was my ready, set, go number. That was what I just mentioned the target was, an event in the future. I got these sketches. It reminded me of a flight deck on a destroyer. And so I'm going, okay, well, that's interesting. I sketched this, which also looks like this, whoops, too far. The superstructure of a destroyer, you can tell. I called it a structure at the time. I didn't want to commit to it being a vessel of some kind. And then these are directly from my session. So I got this impression of an aircraft off in a distance and a ship. It was the middle of the night, but it was in an area surrounded by land that was sandy. I mean, it was a big body of water, but all sides were surrounded by sandy land. And then I got the impression the aircraft dropped something, an object. It was a cylindrical object made out of metal, and it made a guttering, rumbling sound, kind of a steady guttering, rumbling sound. Started off distant, then it approached. The aircraft dropped it and left. People on this vessel notice the object and they have the sense of, oh no, this is unreal. We can't believe this is going on. And this object kind of aimlessly in a way seems to kind of go like this. And then it comes together with where the people are. And this structure or vessel shivers, shakes, and quivers. And there's this loud chang and screech, metallic squeal. And then the vessel cants, in other words, tips, goes out of line, sags, and twists. Okay. It's like the structure was altered in some way, crumpled or bent. The people were angry. They were consternated, if you will, confused, chagrined. So the main points: large gray vessel sailing at night in body of water surrounded by sand. Lone aircraft flying in the distance. Aircraft drops a long cylindrical object with short stubby wings, which emits a roaring, guttering noise. The object flies around aimlessly for a while. Then the object and the vessel come together, and it causes consternation, smoke, and mayhem. Okay. Happened at night in a body of water surrounded by land. The attacking aircraft was originated from a base near the water, and it was directed by a semi-professional military in a third world city that was farther inland, in here somewhere. Okay. I'm presuming you guys can see my cursor and all that. All right. So this was Friday. My monitor I had provided a session that he didn't think was right. He thought I was off. He said, "Oh, Paul, you're off. Well, let's go home for the weekend." So I put that in my safe drawer, the session in my safe drawer, and left. Monday morning, I get a call from Skip Atwater. He says, "Paul, where's that session you did on Friday?" I said, "Well, it's in my safe drawer. Why do you care? I was off." He said, "You haven't seen the paper this morning, have you?" So I got out my copy of the Washington Post, and I proceeded to read exactly what I had said in my session 50 hours before it happened. This was really amazing. It was the best session I ever did before or since. It was as close to 100% accurate, I think, as you can get in a remote viewing session. All right. You can see the aftermath. This was taken a day or two after the attack. You can see what happened to it. A year later, I got to read the after action report on what actually happened and match it to my session. Absolutely correct. So even time is an obstacle in remote viewing. So I'm short on time, speaking of time, so we'll just wrap it up there. Mainstream science, if they ever stop to listen to what the evidence is that we have to present, may well have a reaction like this. Okay. Why is remote viewing important? I don't want to discuss this right now. I want you to think about that, and maybe it can come out in the Q&A. We'll see. All right. So for further information, you can get my book, which is aimed at introducing people to remote viewing at a very basic level, although there's even stuff in here for people who've been around a long time. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at its website of guidetoremoteviewing.com. Here's my website.
All right. So let's give a round of applause for Dr. Paul Smith. I think that's in order. And thank you very much, Paul. I mean, I looked at this presentation 1 year ago, but nonetheless, I still learn a lot just seeing it once again. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions coming in right now. Do you want?
One thing I learned is to make sure my phones are disconnected before I get online.
Yeah, that's a good lesson learned. Yeah, one day you will tell me who are calling you. But anyway, let's see who is what are the attendees asking. So John Conlon is asking, how would a tasking be phrased? What is an example of a tasking? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
I'm actually thinking of putting together a, make sure I'm turned on. I'm actually thinking about putting together a, some kind of paper or class or something on this eventually. But of course, tasking and remote viewing, there's a wide variety of ways you could do it. But how I do it in my classes is I create an arbitrary number, and I always like to use as my number 8675309 because it's easy to remember. And so the task would write down 8675309 and then like write an equal sign or something. And if it's a practice target, we'll say the Eiffel Tower, would say remote view the Eiffel Tower present time. And then the viewer is presented with the number 8675309, and then his or her subconscious takes that number, goes out into the universe to find out what it's linked to, discovered it's linked to the Eiffel Tower and the instructions to remote view it. And then conscious awareness is then motivated to perceive the target and describe it. There's other possibilities, of course. That one would be if you're, for example, trying to find a missing person, then the tasking might read 8675309 equals describe the location of Joe viewer who's missing within certain constraints, right? And of course, the viewer never gets that because you, as a viewer, you absolutely need to be blind to the target. But what may happen, well, you will be given the number, and then your subconscious helps you find the information that you need to present, and then passes it into conscious awareness where you can record it in some way or other.
Okay, thanks a lot for that thorough answer. I want to ask a question myself regarding the current status of remote viewing. The true or most true to the method remote viewing, I would also agree, is controlled remote viewing. But there seems to be many practices or many schools or ways in how remote viewing has been developing recently. Can you elaborate maybe in some of it? What are your perspectives on these different schools? Are there some research on which type of technique is better used for a task or a specific target than other ones? Can you comment on that?
So first off, I disclose my bias. I'm fully committed to controlled remote viewing as it was taught by the folks who originated it. Over the years, as we learned stuff, I've made some minor alterations to what I teach, but I always make sure they're well vetted. There are a bunch of approaches out there. As I mentioned, of course, when they first started off, there was no method. You just tried to be psychic in within the framework of the remote viewing experimental protocol that Ingo Swann first initiated. And of course, once it was declassified, once the whole program in remote viewing was declassified in 1995, then the original was out there. But then, of course, it's kind of normal in human nature to want to put your own brand on something, right? And so people would take take the original methodology and they'd modify it in the way they felt like was the right way to do things and appropriate. Sometimes they did it just to kind of make it unique to them, their particular approach or whatever. And you get this kind of descent from, patriarchal descent, if you will, from the father to the son to the son of the son's son, right? Each time is I should throw daughters in there too, but and each one is a modification of the one before, and sometimes those moderations are useful and practical. Sometimes it's just changing happy to glad, just making a change that doesn't make a difference. Sometimes they actually make the system not as effective, right? Now, the problem is, of course, there's not been research as to which, if any, of these are more effective. It's all subjective. Some people will say, well, I've seen the results from 3 different methodologies or derivations of the original methodology, and I think this one works better. The only thing we know is that they either work the same or there are some that are better than others. Generally speaking, you see this in other aspects of human behavior where, for example, how many methods are there to teach violin, right? There's tons of them. And some will swear by one and some will swear by the other. Ultimately, the final results is what's important. It's a little harder to assess that with remote viewing, but nominally, some means of teaching violin are more effective than other means of teaching violin, and you have to assess that to know. So, is that assessment hasn't been made? One of my proteges is actually thinking about doing an experiment like that. We'll see how that turns out.
Yeah, hopefully we could get more research on that, because I do agree with you. It seems that controlled remote viewing seems to be the golden standard, but updates and evolution is always good to go, unless they are, as you interpret, and there's been mentioned before, to seem to dilute the method. So we wouldn't want that. So hopefully we'll see more research on that. Okay, so I'll shut up and then proceed with next question. So Mikey Lauren is asking you, are there ethical considerations or concerns related to controlled remote viewing, or concerns about who should not be trained in this field?
Well, this is 2 different questions, so I'll answer the first one first. Yes, of course there are ethical concerns. Any human activity that involves another person has some kind of ethical implication, right? And so absolutely there is. Particularly the case where you can, for a technique or an ability that allows you to potentially get confidential information about someone. Now, it's not quite so simple as people portray it with remote viewing, but it does, at least in principle, have that implication. But the other thing is there are other things that in human behavior that have the same potential. Spy cameras and such, and people misuse them all the time, and not just the government, but private people do. They'll put cameras where they shouldn't ought to be, and so on. And so the ethics are pretty clear with controlled remote viewing. How do you enforce those ethics? Well, that's really hard to do, since it is a thing that you can pursue in the privacy of your own home, and nobody knows what you're doing with it, right? So IRVA, the International Remote Viewing Association, has an ethical code on their website that at least tries to govern some of this. It's probably not as complete as it could be, but it's a good faith effort to try and at least spell out what would be ethical practice in using remote viewing and in business relations associated with remote viewing. And this is an ongoing topic and will probably continue to go on forever. But now, what was the second part of the question?
It was regarding the concerns about who should be trained or not.
Oh, right. Well, then you run into a different can of worms. We have a problem in society in general determining, do we abridge people's rights and constrain certain people from learning or acquiring certain items, certain behavior, certain skills or whatever. And society comes down on the side of, yes, there are some people who shouldn't be allowed to have access to certain abilities or certain skills. In fact, the the quintessential example is how to build an atom bomb, right? that information, that ability is strictly reserved, and for good reason. So I don't know where the line gets drawn, and that's of course the challenge. What people shouldn't be allowed to learn remote viewing, or particularly CRV, but any remote viewing. And can you even stop them if you have some kind of parameters that would exclude people? I don't think we have solutions to that. In principle, I'd say there may be a few folks that shouldn't, and not necessarily for negative reasons that they might use it badly. I mean, there are some people who are quite mentally fragile, and in fact, developing their psychic abilities might actually be a trigger for some kind of mental break or something. And so for their own well-being, maybe they shouldn't be allowed. But then how do you determine that? That's another question. I mean, you'd have to give a exhaustive battery of psychological tests to someone to see if they were mentally stable enough to manage remote viewing. Right now, most practitioners, essentially, it's seat of the pants. You go on your own intuition whether someone is suitable to do it. Fortunately, they kind of weed themselves out to a bit, because people who are on the borderline in terms of mental health and whatever, they often aren't successful enough in their lives to raise the kind of money necessary to take that kind of training. So they sort of, just because of the way their lives have unfolded, remove themselves from the possibility. But, it's not universal. Sometimes that's not the case.
Right. And if I'm allowed a follow-up question under that line, we know a little bit about some correlations regarding the targets. If they have an entropic component, if they are luminous, stuff like that, the feedback seems to be quite important. But does it seem to be, in your experience or in the research, does it seem to be any relationship within the intentions towards why you're using remote viewing? If it's a justified use of the ability, does that sometimes decrement the ability in some way, or it doesn't seem to affect how are you using it?
Now, you're talking about something that's a psychological thing, not a remote viewing thing. In other words, individual human psychology would affect the answer to that. If you, as a viewer, felt uncomfortable with doing something, that might stop you from remote viewing it. But different people have different comfort levels. For example, there may not be, so it may not affect me to remote view some kind of battle sequence that might be going on in the Middle East, right? In terms of, the government needing to know about it. But someone else might be highly disturbed by it, right? Now that's, of course, not exactly the answer. There are maybe some things that I wouldn't be comfortable with remote viewing from an ethical perspective, and yet somebody else might. So remote viewing in and of itself seems to be essentially amoral. You can remote view anything in principle, but the ability to remote view things that may be questionable really boils down to human psychology and what each individual considers, even subconsciously, to be inappropriate or unsuitable.
Okay, thanks. So we're running out of time, so maybe one final question. I will ask two questions because they are from the same person. So Paul Fogarty asks if has there ever been an accomplished artist who has drawn detailed pictures of the targets?
Yes. Well, of course, it depends on how you define detailed here, but Joe McMoneagle has done some amazing stuff. He did an outbounder that was Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, which you'd be hard pressed to draw anything more accurate if you were there looking at it, right? Some of my sketches have been pretty accurate, and again, that depends on what you determine as detailed. And there are others who've done really nice jobs as well. That's not to say the majority turn out that way, because they don't. Usually they're much more impressionistic rather than realistic. But I do have, I did a presentation at IRVA years ago, The Art of Remote Viewers, in which I collected together about 30 or 40 of these really impressive remote viewing results, and being both accurate and quite artistically well rendered. So the answer is yes. Is it a common thing to have that kind of success? probably not common in general as you add up all the possible remote viewing sessions that have been done.
Okay, and then maybe a final question from the program chair of the upcoming conference.
Well,
John
I have a question for Mr. Fogarty, Paul Fogarty. Is he related to John Fogarty? Is what I want to know.
Okay, hopefully he'll let us know
Yeah,
in the
he can
comment.
put it in the chat or something. But go ahead. What's your question, or what's the question?
So, what do you see? How do you find the not the usefulness, but the objective or the purpose of remote viewing in the current state of society? There's a lot of issues that we're facing right now. Is there some ways or some closing comments that you want to share in how this ability can help us push onward?
Well, obviously, there's some human problems that remote viewing isn't going to solve. It's not a cure-all. It's not the magic ingredient that'll solve every problem we ever encounter, right? It is, but there are some things that can. Obviously, it was adopted by the intelligence and military intelligence community as a way of solving problems they couldn't solve in collecting intelligence that might be crucial to national security. And in fact, we solved some of those problems, generally on a smaller scale, but nonetheless, it was a tool that even if it wasn't perfect, it was still successful in enough occasions that it justified it being used. And obviously, our problems seem to have proliferated today. That's a hard word to say, proliferated. And I can imagine the Ukrainians would find it useful, although frankly, drone technology is probably in most cases more valuable than remote viewing on just open battlefield scenarios. But there are times when it would still be handy in an environment like that. But it's also useful in solving criminal cases, helping the police if they would be willing to accept that help. Finding missing kids, that's been done, not often, but it's been done. Obviously, people are using and investing right now in the whole ARV community, and of course, they're fairly closed-mouthed about how much they are making or not making out there, but there is certainly record that some folks have done really well with using remote viewing as an investment tool. And there's in my book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, I have a whole chapter on applying remote viewing in the real world today. And so that's probably a good place for people to go to answer that question.
Very good. So thanks a lot, Dr. Smith. So before we end, there's some comments from the executive director of the Parapsychological Association, Annalisa Ventola. So she's here with us.
Annalisa, our heroine.
Hello, I'm back. Thank you for your talk, Paul. It's always great to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you for hosting, Ramses.
You have new glasses.
I know. Yeah. New look. So this is our last talk of the day, and we have on the schedule that is happy hour. Obviously, in a virtual environment, you have to bring your own beverage, whether that be tea or coffee or a more adult beverage. And in the meantime, though, as we close, I just want to remind the audience that this was the purpose of today was to help define concepts and research that is going to be presented at the Breakthrough 2022 conference, which is happening June 23rd through the 26th. We're going to have like over 40 presentations over 4 days. Lots of opportunities for interaction. There's a forum, there's chat, there's also going to be a lounge there. And as of right now, this is like the last day before early registration ends. So currently the full price or the price of the conference is $199. And if you are a member, then there's a 50% discount. And that is if you are a member of the PA or the SSE, either organization. But on Monday, that price goes up to $249. So if you are interested in the conference today, tomorrow, definitely the time to register. And these videos, if you go up and look at view schedule right now, you can already find that you can watch the replay of these videos. So if there's anything that you missed today, please do go ahead and go back and have a look at them. You can also find our videos on Facebook and on YouTube. So I think I covered everything. Am I missing anything, Ramses?
No, maybe just a comment that if you need any help, you can send us a message to office@parapsych.org or support@scientificexploration.org.
That's
So
right.
I have a quick operational question. Is there a way to save the chat? I'd like to see what folks said.
The chat will continue to exist for as long as this air meet is open, which will be for at least a month. So
okay.
at your leisure, you might just go in and copy out whatever you want.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Did I cover it?
No, I think so.
All right.
Thank you.
I will see you guys in the lounge.
All right. Thank you,
All
guys.
right. Oh, wait. I didn't cover everything. I know that John is at a table, and not John, I'm sorry. Lloyd has volunteered to stay back and answer more questions about his presentation. Paul, are you able to stick around if people have more questions on remote viewing?
Yeah, for a little bit. Or will we do that at a table or just right here?
Yeah, I believe there's already a remote viewing table that
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll go join it for a bit. I do have my sister coming to visit from Idaho, so.
Okay, well, we're happy to have you for as little or as long as you can share your time.
Well, I appreciate that. And those who have adult beverages, I find it ironic that they call it adult beverages when it makes you act more like a kid. So
I think that's half the fun. All right, I will see you guys later.